Most overrated movie of all time.
Go. Okay. Well, we were just saying, I think Princess Bride has to be on the list for most overrated movies of all time. But there's got to be others.
I think
Wonder
it's
Woman.
heresy.
Wonder Woman.
Oh, interesting.
That movie was awful. And I think it got a whole lot of publicity because it was supposed to be like some great feminist victory because they finally had like a woman lead. Oh. Which is actually really interesting because Gal Gadot is now getting a bunch of stuff because she's in the Israeli military, which is completely...
Is she really?
Yeah. She's being like canceled by her own people.
Carrie Gress just published a book on feminism and I think goes into some of these...
This Wonder Woman.
Yeah.
But then, like, the actual hero in the Wonder Woman movie is not even Wonder Woman.
Who is it?
It's like the guy. I don't even remember who the actor's name is.
Have you seen Princess Bride?
Yes.
You have. Okay.
No.
Okay.
And I even saw it as a kid.
Oh, it was Rory who hasn't seen it. Okay.
Yeah. No, I think
I haven't seen Wonder Woman.
Don't do it.
I've seen the Princess Bride.
It's really awful, and it begins. It's completely unexplained. It begins, of course, in like a mythical world where she's like with the Amazonian women, which is like this, and she's like training or whatever, and then she shows up in like 1915 Britain. Like carrying around like a shield and a sword, and she's surprised everyone looks at her weird. She's like half naked in her little like leotard wandering around. And I'm like, she's supposed to be like a goddess. What is she doing looking like such an idiot?
Yeah.
And the movie actually almost looks interesting for a while because you think it's going to make like a provocative argument about war. Because they're like, this war is just pointless. There's no actual bad guys. Because it was World War I. They did something interesting. The actual Wonder Woman story is supposed to take place in World War II, and there's clearly bad guys in World War II, the Nazis. World War I is ambiguous. Right? And so they're playing with that. I'm like, oh, this is actually kind of interesting. The movie's bad, but at least there's an interesting philosophical argument about war here. No. It turns out that about 2/3 of the way through the movie, it's actually the whole war is being led by the Greek god Mars, who is a mustachioed British man who happens to be the prime minister.
And that's why you watch this podcast. Because not only do you get rich theological and biblical hermeneutics,
get my readings on Wonder Woman. I could bash just about every Marvel movie there is, except for the original Iron Man and the Guardians of the Galaxy movies.
Interesting.
Those are the only good ones.
I was just telling one of the co-producers, the bar for entertainment for me is really low. When I seek entertainment. When I watch a movie, I just want to be like base level entertained. The bar is so low that I'm rarely disappointed. If something's like gratuitously violent or there's gratuitous nudity, like there are certain things that, but generally like a bad story or I tend to engage media just to like kind of numb out or pull back for a bit. I actually dislike media where I have to be highly engaged and thinking. Yeah.
And does that apply across media? Like, would you say that's true with music? So do you not like classical music?
Yeah.
You want like just...
No, it doesn't actually. I think things like classical music, I tend to feel more engaged or more attentive to it. But I won't listen to it. That will vary when I listen to it. Like, especially after work or in the evening, I don't like thinking very hard in the evening.
So what's your viewing?
Say it again?
What do you view? Like when you sit down?
TV. Last night we watched, with the kids, I watched Loki on Disney+. And it was like fine. Like there's probably all sorts of like, if I was in like academic mode, that's what it is. If I was in academic mode, I think I could sit down and give like thoughtful critiques and really like break apart the story and get, but like after 5:30, I just want to like.
You feel like you've been taking things apart all day.
Yeah, and I just want to like sort of be passively entertained. And I watch it and I go, oh, that was, and the kids will be like, Dad, but it was crazy because you can't time travel. I'm like, yeah, no, it was fine. Like, I don't know. Yeah, okay, Loki sits at the end of the world and brings all the threads of time and space together and all this, and like somehow holds them, and we're not supposed to question that he's holding all the threads. Like, whatever. I'm fine with it, too. Like, yeah, it was great. Got to spend some time with the kids, you know. The dog was there. We pet the dog, kiss all the kids, bless them. Good night, guys. Welcome to Drawing Flame, a podcast where you're going to learn more about Shane and I and how we think about the world and our lives than, I don't know.
No, this is great. No, I mean, I'm interested though because here we are, and we have this podcast we've called Drawing Flame, and you know, in part we can talk about like how the podcast came about, what we want it to do, what we want it to be, and the name captures a lot of that. So I find it interesting because here you are talking about your vulgar love of, you know, Marvel
who
television.
Said that?
Marvel television. I just spent a whole bunch of time bashing Marvel.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like a Marvel TV show. Right? Yeah. I've instantly lost half
all
of our
respect.
potential
All
audience.
respect. Yeah, that's true.
They've all given up on me. But
Stay with me. Stay with it for me.
So Gerard Manley Hopkins, I mean, this isn't decidedly a kind of thinking people's poetry.
Yeah.
So why did that poem come to mind for you?
Yeah. So we wanted to do a podcast when the idea of doing a podcast was introduced, and they put us together. They said, "What do you guys think? Maybe you could co-host this." For me, when we were sitting around thinking about the name, how do we come up with a name for a podcast? A couple things came to mind. The first was that opening line is kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. It's such a dynamic image. At least for me, when I think about it, I see this sort of, I see this pond, I see dragonflies tracing through the air, right? As the orange setting sun hits their iridescent wings and the wings capture that sunlight, it looks like they're drawing flame. And the kingfishers are such vibrant birds to begin with. And they're flying around trying to catch these dragonflies. And I mean, it's such a dynamic image. And as I was thinking about a podcast, I was thinking I want a podcast that captures sort of the dynamism of people's lives, that like brings people to life. The thing I love the most about therapy, I'm a psychologist and I sit with people throughout the day. I love seeing people begin to come alive, to like regain a sense of like, I don't want to use the word dynamism again, I'm overusing it, but to just like, to have color and movement and like whatever that image is that Hopkins lays out in that first line, to see people's lives start to regain some of that.
Right. And I mean, it's interesting because you're talking about in the context of your counseling. I mean, do you see in some way that it's precisely the people telling a story or narrating, like you're inviting the story at them? I mean, it seems that they come to life precisely in the telling of their story.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, that was another thing we talked about. You really began to draw that out too, as you're watching the kingfisher and the dragonfly. They're tracing these things, but part of what that can be is that can be a sort of, it can be sort of a metaphor for like our stories and how our stories wind and weave, but they're touched by the divine flame, by the Holy Spirit, and so they're animated and they come alive. And so it's the story. We both agree that like story is so important, and I love story. I love story. I love hearing the story of people's lives, and I like hearing people begin to maybe re-envision their story, retell their story. There's a type of therapy called narrative therapy. And the idea is we sort of think about our lives in story. And there's agents, and there's actors, there's protagonists, but sometimes we're telling the wrong story. Sometimes we don't see all the pieces of the story. Sometimes we don't see how our story is nested in a bigger story. And so part of therapy, I mean, one way of thinking about therapy is I'm learning people's stories. I'm reflecting their story back to them. I'm helping them maybe see parts of their story they didn't appreciate, or bring their story into maybe greater proportion. Meaning like when you work with people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, oftentimes what happens is the traumatic event sort of stands out above the rest of the story.
Right.
It feels like everything is oriented to the traumatic event. And part of what we try to do is help that event sort of regain its place.
Get leveled out with
in the broader story. It is a piece, and it's an important piece, but it's a piece of your story. It's not the culmination of your story. It's not the focal point. It's a piece. And so helping people, I love story, and I love, one thing that I think struck me is that so many podcasts I listen to, what excites me is getting to know the people. Yeah, the person.
It's like the first 30 minutes or something where they chat about themselves and then they go off into their...
I love that. Because that for me contextualizes even their ideas.
Right, that their ideas develop in a story. Yeah,
somebody told me once, research is me search. So when you're in like grad school, or like the things that we tend to be drawn to are somehow like related to our stories. They're related to something about us that matters or sticks out. So I worked with a person once who was really interested in alcohol research, and did very well and was well published. But come to find out, this person's father was an alcoholic, and so
you get how it's driven.
You begin to understand, when you understand a person's story, their academic interests, their intellectual interests, their
it strikes me, it's like, we have this image, and it's the kingfisher trying to catch the dragonfly. And more often than not, I'm thinking of myself as the dragonfly. There's also a way that you could place getting eaten. But sometimes, I think of myself as the kingfisher. But I guess what I'm saying is, I think sometimes there's a way in our life where we're chasing the dragonfly, and dragonflies, like most insects, are kind of spastic.
Yeah.
And it's like, so you can imagine that it must have been, it's really beautiful, the image that Hopkins is painting, but all the dragonflies, especially when you get a whole bunch of them,
Yes.
it's just this kind of
Seems random and chaotic.
seems random, but I'm sure there's actually a whole lot of order when you watch it, right? I mean, I know that, some insects are very clear, like bees have little dances they do or something. I don't know what dragonflies have. Maybe they do.
I don't either.
But I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking of is this image of ourselves as the kingfisher trying to catch this dragonfly. Is sometimes you're so focused on catching the dragonfly that you're not even aware of where you've flown, if we stay with the image. Right? You've been pursuing something. I was actually just talking to a good friend of mine earlier today, and he was talking about, which, I mean, many of us have had this experience, through schooling and all these different stages of schooling, and he had been in the military, and all the times you move around when you're in school, and early jobs, and you switch jobs several times right when you get out of school and everything. And you're talking about in the last 12 years, he's moved something like 12 times.
Unbelievable.
Right? Which, when I think back, is I might not have hit that number, but I'm probably not far from that right number. Right? And he was talking about now he's married, he's settling into his family home, his wife's due with a baby in December, and it's like he suddenly now has had this moment, he's been tracing dragonflies for so long. That he has this moment where he steps back, he's actually figuring out where over the lake he even is.
Yes.
Right? And so I think that's one of the things I think about with these stories is sometimes I don't even think we realize, the whole research, yes, the alcoholism story is actually maybe kind of really clear.
So clear. Yeah.
Right? But people ask me that, well, how did you get to studying what you study? And so sometimes it's really obvious. Okay, so I study St. Augustine. Okay, well enough. And you think to yourself, okay, I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, as part of the Diocese of St. Augustine, right? And so I go to St. Augustine all the time as a kid, one of the oldest city in America, 458 years old or whatever it is now. And you'd go into the cathedral, and there was the stained glass windows with the life of St. Augustine. Now, that's really simply autobiographical, and maybe that's enough to explain how I ended up.
I would have thought it was like the crazy life you led prior.
I didn't go to the University of Miami. Yeah. So that could have been it. Right? No, and I mean, there is some of this attraction to that he was like the rhetorician who practiced sophistry and then comes to the wisdom of our Lord. And I loved speech and debate, and I delighted in just arguing for the sake of argument. But right, you get these layers and layers. And so those could explain why I study St. Augustine. Yeah. But then as you press deeper, some of these things I think maybe are in the Lord's providence. This is where the Lord is guiding you and you don't have it. Some of these things I wouldn't even known. Because I think it's one of these things, I showed up here to get my master's degree in theology, and I'm talking to Steve Hildebrand, and you're just like, what are you interested in studying? And then I feel like I need to really know what I'm talking about. So instead of just being like, I just want to study theology, I'm like, I'm here to study St. Augustine. So I'm already in a PhD program, but I'm in a general
MA program,
an MA program that's mainly for training catechists, right? But I'm like, I'm here to study St. Augustine. And it's like, based on what? I had read almost no theology.
The windows at my church.
Windows at my church. But then you begin to see, the Lord had a lot there. So it was interesting because you're talking about particular questions that maybe press on you a lot. I remember it was only in hindsight, kind of like one of these things I was talking about with my friend, when you're standing back and you realize where you are after chasing all these dragonflies. I was looking back and I realized I was a literature major in undergrad, so obviously in love with stories and poetry like Hopkins. Same. But one of the things I kept constantly writing about, and the phrase I would have used at the time in my undergraduate was I kept talking about agency. So many of my literature papers were about agency and characters trying to assert their agency, characters' agency not being taken from them. And I was fascinated with different questions, all these different questions, and as they related to agency, right? Characters who committed suicide in stories, was that an attempt to claim a kind of agency? Right? I had all these questions, but then you all of a sudden, and I had a kind of, almost I would say, discomfort with agency, including my own agency. I don't know, I was trying to feel something out.
Yeah.
And then you come to Augustine, and what is Augustine known as in the tradition? He's the doctor of grace. And in this way, he subverts or puts agency, what in the Christian tradition we call it free will, he places under, below grace, and grace becomes primary. And and so then looking at these questions I kept puzzling with and wrestling with and fighting with.
Yeah.
Not in my any way of drawing that story. I didn't know enough about Augustine to get that. Oh no, all your questions and your quandaries about agency actually have to do. Augustine's going to be able to be the best person in the tradition to answer those questions for you.
Okay, that's really funny. I think there's probably a couple ways of reading the Hopkins poem, but so I'm going to tie this in. I think you mentioned grace and subverting our sort of agency to grace. The first part of the poem, right? You have all these things. You have kingfishers, you have bells, you have rocks falling down wells. You've got, and he says all of these things are like selves, and I think in that the first part of the poem, what he's getting at is these sort of material things they express something of their inner selves in what they do. You know, the kingfisher, the dragonfly, the rocks falling, the bell ringing. What it is,
Right.
its sort of inner nature, its inner essence is expressed through sort of what it does. Then he has this line, he says, but I say more. Like there's something beyond just what I do expressing myself. And this is where he brings in grace. Okay, I'll read it real quick. He says, but I say more. The just man justices keeps grace that keeps all his goings graces. Acts in God's eye, what in God's eye he is, Christ. All the things prior to this act as what they are. So the rock acts as the rock as it falls. The tongue of the bell is right. He says those things are all selves. Myself it speaks and spells. All those other things in their action speak of themselves. Me, myself, selves. What I do is me. For that I came. But man is different.
Right.
Because man doesn't just express himself. He doesn't say myself. He doesn't say what I do is me. He says man acts in God's eye what he is, Christ. Mm-hmm. And so in some way, you're talking about agency and grace and Augustine. And in some ways, I think what he's saying here is that unlike these other things that express a certain agency, like you know what it is by what it does,
right.
Man doesn't express himself. Man acts as Christ through grace. He keeps all his graces going. And grace is the thing that makes him act the way he really is, which is Christ. It's not just self, it's Christ. Right. And so in some ways, like you're talking about Augustine, I'm thinking, yeah, that uncomfortability with agency, it's not just I.
Right.
You know, it isn't just I, it isn't just me, it isn't just myself or selves. Grace allows me to say, not I, but Christ in me.
Right, and then when you start telling the story has a lot of other agents.
Yes.
And it's got an all-powerful,
yes,
all-knowing agent.
Yes.
Right, who's writing that story? So I imagine this happens to your counseling all the time too, is people begin to tell their story and they're the only agent in the story.
Yeah.
You know, it becomes the only agent in the story. Or to where even the trauma that happens to them becomes their doing. Because if they're the only agent in the story, 100%. Then the trauma is their fault 100%. Or something they did, right? And so it opens a space. Yeah. Right, but also it suggests to us, as you were saying that, you're painting that beautifully, of like the rock shows rockness.
Yeah.
The kingfisher, shows what a kingfisher does. Is that we aren't reducible either to our what we do.
Yeah.
That we are more than what we just do.
Yeah. No, I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. I think as we think about what we want this to be, we've talked about it, but one, I love hearing people's stories. It's a huge part of what I love in therapy. I love getting to know people, hearing their story. And so there's a natural fascination with that. But we're also both academics. We're both teachers. We're both professors. And so to be able to bring these worlds together in and through this sort of St. Paul Center platform where we get to say and interview authors and speakers and intellectuals, priests and religious, and we get to not only sort of press them intellectually to understand their thought, but at least from my perspective, we get to know the man or the woman as well, to give this sort of deeper perspective or picture, to ask the questions about how has grace worked in your life. And we're going to have some smart people on. We're going to have some undoubtedly smart people who have written some great books and are very erudite. But that's a piece of it. There's a deeper piece, which is this human. My favorite line from Pope Benedict's papacy, his papal motto, was "Cor ad cor loquitur," heart speaking to heart. And there's something about that to bring out the fleshiness of somebody's heart, even as we're discussing their academic works and their publishings and to know them.
Yeah, I love the catechism. The catechism, very much in that same spirit, describes the heart as a place of encounter.
Yeah.
It describes the heart as a place of encounter. And I think it's so right? That and I hope, that I hope our viewers, our listeners, however they take this in, I want them to have that, right? I want them to feel invited into that space.
Yes.
Right? And I think we probably both have experienced that as professors, is I can tell you have that moment where you're teaching, where you look at your students. And often it is when you're opening up your own story.
For sure.
Right? When you're opening up your own story and you begin to say, like, I'm core at core locators happening right here. Heart is speaking to heart. And they're being drawn in. And I think the kind of people, we hope that the guests we bring in are the kind of people who not only write great books, people buy their books, but they're the kind of people who our listeners, our viewers, begin to tell their own story better.
Yeah.
Right? Make sense of themselves.
Yeah.
Right? And begin to be able to place themselves in the larger narrative. And I mean, St. Paul, the St. Paul Center, this is about the Bible.
Yeah.
Right? There's a bigger story.
There's a bigger story.
There's a lot
which
bigger
we all
story.
Participate.
Yeah. And so begin to find themselves in the story, make sense of who they are. Because I think we're desperate in this age for people to have a sense of who they are.
Yeah.
Right? People are looking for a way to make sense of themselves.
There's a crisis of identity. Undoubtedly, there's a crisis of identity. And part of what gives us this identity, I mean, I think there's all sorts of ways of thinking about this, but our story, understanding the narrative or the context, rightly understanding it, can give us a deep sense of identity.
Right.
And I know I watch podcasts. I was going to say I watch them all the time. I don't, actually. That's not true.
I'd be envious if you haven't that much time. When do you do that? On your 2-minute commute?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, when I'm laying in bed falling asleep sometimes, I'm scrolling YouTube. If I come across a podcast, I'll listen to a short clip, and I'll oftentimes, like, the questions that I have are rarely the questions that the host is asking. I want to know, like what was your dad like? What was your mom like? How did you grow up? What was college like? How did you decide to? I mean, there's all these questions I have where I want to hear their story. I want to give them space to tell that story, and I think we're going to find our rhythm, because neither of us have ever hosted a podcast before, and so a little bit of grace from our viewers would be greatly appreciated. But we'll find our rhythm, I promise. Because I don't think either of us like doing things badly or poorly. No. But I want us to be asking those questions and strike that balance between sort of academic learning and content, but also like deep human encounter and helping someone else unfold their story for themselves and for the viewers or the listeners, and allowing us to see how God has moved in your life. So often for me, that witness can be so impactful for me.
Right, when you see someone who's secure in their own identity, it reaffirms us, right? I mean, we want to pursue that. We want to find that. I mean, the image I'm remembering when we were having our meeting and we were trying to talk about what this podcast ought to be, what could the name be. I mean, the image I threw out there, which you kind of resonated with, is, and I think maybe this gets a sense for our listeners and viewers of what we're looking for, is that conversation where you've had a wonderful meal.
Yeah.
And you're sitting back.
Yes.
Maybe you're eating that piece of pie.
Yes.
Thanksgiving's not that far away.
Yes.
Right? You're eating a piece
Pecan
of pie.
pie. Yep.
And you're just talking, and the conversation's delightful. And it is interesting that when you have a good friend over, or a person who is not even necessarily a friend yet, but is a person you know who you can open your heart with, you do naturally kind of gravitate from the intellectual to the playful and the silly, the familial, into their own personal life, right? And that space, and they have a natural, and I think that one of the things that, I've heard you say this before, right, is like people are, not only do they have an identity crisis, but people are lonely.
People are so lonely.
People are lonely, and they want to be part of conversations like this. And I think part of why we delight in podcasts instinctively is we're not having enough conversations like this.
You get to sort of voyeur into, it's like a voyeurism where I get to hear a nice, delightful conversation. People love that kind of thing.
Right, and so this is a chance to extend that even more, I hope.
Yeah.
In a way that I think is inviting, right?
I hope so.
I don't hope it has pretenses.
Yeah, I hope not. So I don't want that. I want it to have enough intellectual substance that people are learning something and they feel like they're really engaged and happy to have listened. I don't want it to be like frivolous conversation, but I do want it to have a sort of natural conversation flow, that if you were sitting at a coffee shop listening to our conversation, just hearing what
which is common around here,
Yeah, that's right.
And they happen to have Gerard Manley Hopkins on their table.
Actually, I didn't know you were a literature major in undergrad. I was too.
You were?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Where were you, Baylor? Was that Baylor?
No, I went to the University of Scranton. Graduated from the University of Scranton.
Was this before Office fame?
Oh yeah, long before the Office.
Scranton wasn't even on the map.
Oh no. I mean, not in the nation's eyes. In my eyes, it was, but it's always been on mine. Yeah. So yeah, I love.
So how did literature contribute then to your journey to psychology, therapy, professor?
What's funny is the interest for me was I started off bio pre-med. There was sort of I started off bio pre-med, Realized that quickly wasn't going to work for a host of reasons. And then I thought I just need a degree. I just need a degree that I can. I think I need to graduate. So I need to do something I can graduate. I like reading. I like Shakespeare. So I'll do this. And in these courses, what I found fascinating was, in some sense, authors have a sort of demigod. Like, as an author, you get to write. You can have the person cross the street and bump into the love of their life or get hit by a car. I mean, it's like, and so thinking about like the choices the author makes in every poem and every story, why those choices, why those particular images, I think it's fascinating. But then I also really got interested in sort of the psychology of characters. I mean,
That makes sense.
writing somebody's story and what kind of psychology emerges, and are they really capturing like this sort of full human psychology? But then I took this sort of like, I had a bit of a conversion, and I decided I really wanted to understand the faith better. So I thought I was actually going to go to like a catechetics like program. Like I just wanted to like learn a little more about the faith, the dog, So I applied to Ave Maria, and I got in, and I mean, there were tremendous people down there. Father Matt Lamb was there at the time, God rest his soul. Michael Dauphiné, Roger Nutt, Greg Vall. I mean, great people. But they were doing like theology.
Yeah, and those guys are
Seriously,
rigorous.
right? So the first day, like, and then they put like Kant on the desk, and I was like, what is this? Like, I've never seen a 13-line long sentence, with like 17 commas, and like, we're reading Schillebeck's and Schleiermacher and Kant, and I was like, I just thought we were going to read the catechism and be like, a sacrament.
Can you tell me the gifts of the Holy Spirit?
I did not. But they introduced us to a lot of St. Thomas, and in reading St. Thomas, it reinvigorated that sort of interest. And he says so much about, he has a sort of anthropology, like sort of what man is, and he details a sort of psychology, a Thomistic psychology. And it got me interested in, the intellect, the will, the passions. Mm-hmm. How do we put flesh on this? Can psychology help me put flesh on this? Right. And chart out a course for how people can live better, practically. And so that's how I got there. But I still retain a love for, I don't read a lot at all, like fun literature, nonfiction. Right. But I still have a deep love and profound respect for literature and poetry. And
seems like the human comes through in literature.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel that's what attracted me.
Yeah, very much so.
The people are there.
How'd you end up in literature? Yeah, why literature?
So I showed up at the University of Miami, and I was an international studies major, which was a big major at the University of Miami because the entire world, the United Nations, might as well be at the University of Miami. I think I had a friend from almost every Latin American country, when I was there. I had like the niece of the president of the Dominican Republic. Right? It was, it was a fascinating place. It was fascinating. So a great place to do that. And I thought, I'm just going to go off and be some diplomat, work for the State Department or something. But in many ways, I had pretty immediately, actually, upon showing up on campus, when confronted with the Sodom and Gomorrah that was the University of Miami, I had a kind of, I don't know if it was a conversion or a flight. Mm-hmm. It was like the flight from Egypt, a flight to the Lord. And I went, and I was like, I went to the campus ministry there. It was St. Augustine's Church, also, I'm sure, coincidental to the Lord's providence. Coincidence, yeah. And I went to St. Augustine's, and the priest there was brand new. He had just been reassigned, Father Michael Carruthers, saintly man, became my spiritual director, a wonderful friend. And he gave this homily, and he was brand new there, and he gave this homily talking about the Irish missionary priests. He's Irish, I'm Irish, so he's giving this priest about this. The Irish missionary priests, they used to come, and he gave this image, they would used to bring a brown paper bag of soil with them from Ireland, because they knew they were never going to go back. And they wanted to be buried under Irish soil. Beautiful. So when they would die, they wanted the Irish soil sprinkled over them so they could be... Awesome. Right, so again, power of stories, right? This story just grabbed me. Yeah. Because I was feeling homeless. Like, I had left this beautiful home, and I had loved every second, and I just hated living in the dorms. Yeah. I hated everything I was being subjected to, and seeing and hearing and whatever else in the dorms. And so I was just like, I'm going to go to daily mass as many times as I can. So I went like 46 days in a row or something of daily mass. Which is a weird thing for a college freshman to challenge himself to.
Outside of Franciscan,
yeah. Right, especially, I was not at Franciscan, right? Yeah. But a part of that just became my own quest for understanding myself. Yeah. Right? I think I very much had this experience of kind of like for the first time stepping back and like asking some kind of personal question. So literature just came in very quickly as like a thing that I think I just started taking a few classes and it just like took over. And literature, the like you were saying, these authors were asking the sorts of questions I was interested in.
Yeah.
And they were asking them in ways that I could wrestle with.
Yeah.
Like the images and the stories, and in a way that maybe I could wrestle with things that I wasn't ready to wrestle with myself. But because it was externalized in this character, I could be really critical of the story about something that I needed to be critical about in myself.
Dude, that is,
or name it.
Art therapy is
this
well, because it's like it's a bridge and a buffer. It's a buffer, so it feels a little bit removed from you.
Right.
But it is a bridge to something real and deep and internal.
And this is funny because we began here, we were talking about how you like most of your movies to be meaningless.
Yeah.
I'm very much, I guess, in the art therapy thing. Like that my movies, my books, the music I listen to, it's all therapeutic for me. Like that's, and I very much always did that with music, but I'd say in college that started happening with literature.
Yes.
Then in some way, like, okay, I'm going to wrestle with Faulkner.
Yeah.
And if I wrestle with Faulkner, I'm figuring something out about myself.
Yes.
Or in particular, I just fell in love with like 19th century French literature.
Yeah.
And just like, I was fascinated by these guys, right? So you would get these like
awesome.
different books that you would just grab a hold of and you would wrestle with their world. And
That's awesome. I made a reference the other day. I made a Hemingway reference to somebody at the university. He wrote a book called A Movable Feast. And it's basically about his time, he's marching through France and he's just like sort of detailing his exploit and like they're eating. The numbers of bottles of wine that were drunk as Hemingway is like working his way through France. But there were some faculty members who had this like huge spread out on the table and they were English faculty. And I was like, oh, a movable feast, huh? And they like didn't.
They didn't like
it.
your
They
joke.
didn't like it. It wasn't, yeah.
They're not Hemingway fans.
That's fair.
At
That's
our
fair.
university.
Yeah, that's fair. That makes sense. No, I think you're right, man. I think I like that idea, especially of artists wrestling with questions that I wanted to wrestle with, but in a way that felt safe and a little less jarring to me. I mean, it's jarring, but in not as internal. Like reading, I don't know. You read James Joyce, you read Faulkner, you read. There is a jarringness to these things.
Right.
You read, Flannery O'Connor. I mean, her work is jarring, and she intends it to be. But yeah, you can wrestle with those questions in a way that can personally move you and change you, but it still has a little bit of a distance. And so, I agree. I think, yeah, I really enjoyed my time in undergrad.
Yeah. And I mean, to me, I think it's almost like especially when you're like showing up at college and you don't necessarily have good friends. Or you haven't made them yet.
At all.
Either. I mean,
Yeah.
and I ended up having some wonderful friends, but that took real time.
Yes.
And even then, you have your pride, so how much vulnerability do you have even with good friends? And like, it's not easy, right? It's almost like I felt like I had these masters of the human spirit.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I could see how things played out and worked out. I think there's a movie I love, which is a thinking person's movie. Oh, that's delightful. Owen Wilson. It's the only thinking person's movie Owen Wilson's ever been in. A Midnight in Paris.
Oh yeah, sure.
I don't think he's ever been in another thinking person's movie.
Yeah.
But I love that movie because he's writing a novel. He's been writing like junk screenplays or something for movies.
Just when he gets transported back with all these guys.
He goes back in time, right? And he's back with them. But I love this. He's writing his own novel, and there's a point where he like writes the novel and he's going back in time and he gives it to Gertrude Stein. Mm-hmm. And I can't remember if it's Gertrude Stein or Ernest Hemingway. One of them makes this comment like, what I can't understand is how the main character doesn't know his wife is having an affair. Right? And then he's like, what? She's not. And she's like, obviously she is. But right, in the movie, it's like his fiancée is having an affair with him. But it's almost like he couldn't even recognize it. But in the process of writing his story, he was revealing this truth that was transparent even through the story.
I love it.
Right, but I think that's what I see in stories. And I think the same thing can happen not just in literature, but that's what I've come to appreciate in other people's stories. It's like they begin to tell a story and you begin to say, oh no, they're naming something. Mm-hmm. I can see that in what, and I hope our guests do that, right? They begin to open up a space and they start talking about something. And you're like, oh no, they're naming something. I've precisely been there. I've precisely gone through that. Or you realize like, I should be going through that. I need to open myself to that space, right? That there's that invitation that takes it a little bit further away from you.
I forget maybe it's, is it the movie about San Jose Maria Escriva, There Be Dragons?
There be dragons, yeah.
Anyway, I sort of love that image of, like, there be dragons within. There is this process of, it brings together story and therapy, and there's a journey of discovery, self-discovery, And that's not enough, right? Self-knowledge alone isn't enough, but the desert fathers had I think really appreciated deep self-awareness and self-knowledge, to understand myself and my psychology and my desires and and literature helps, I think, do that. It invites us to this discovery and this, because there be dragons within, and to sort of go within and see ourselves and recognize and notice those parts of ourselves that we've shut away, locked away, alienated. And when you see characters do this, or when you see literature invite you to consider something in your own life and begin that or deepen that discovery, I love that. I love that. And it's hard and scary, but there's real human growth and flourishing to be achieved by being willing to do that work of discovery and rediscovery and become self-aware, not as an end in and of itself.
But I think the gift we have as Christians, right, though, is that turn inward. Like we were talking about this earlier, I'm not the only agent in that process.
Yeah. Augustine's great here, right? He looks within, right? He does all this looking without, and then he looks within.
And that's where he encounters God.
Yes.
And so it's not right, because Augustine, you'll talk to your students and they'll get confused about this, because Augustine's definition of sin is curvatus in se, to be curved in on oneself, to be caved in oneself. And you think, well, that's weird, because also...
That's where we found God.
But it's this collapse on yourself that becomes, anxiety-ridden, self-referential, self-obsessed, right? Versus a turn inward, where the heart becomes a place of encounter.
Yes.
Where the cor ad cor loquitur can be to another person, but it can be to the Sacred Heart of our Lord Jesus Christ, right? That this turn inward becomes a place.
Yes.
But that makes that turn inward so much safer, as you feel like you're turning inward, and you're turning inward with someone else. But also, it strikes me that when Augustine, when you read the Confessions, right, his master autobiography, when he actually has that successful turn inward, it actually happens in a conversation. He's getting ready to go back to Africa. He's been baptized by Augustine with his son and his best friend Alypius, who he describes as his soul's brother. A beautiful image for friendship, right?
Yeah.
And there he is at the beach, and he's talking to his mother, Monica. And Monica...
She dies soon.
Right, she dies soon after. And she makes this really weird comment, which you wouldn't ever want your mom to make. She's like, you can bury me anywhere. She just brings this out of nowhere, and Augustine's like, what in the world, Mom? You can't don't say stuff like that. It's grotesque.
No. We're talking about that now.
Don't talk about that. Right? And so then they start talking about, what the life in heaven will be like and everything else, right? But it's actually in this dialogue that he has his first successful real encounter of God, and describes his mother and he together leaving the first fruits of their spirit behind with God. Right? But I find that interesting in itself. So the turn inward can be a turn inward. It should never be a curvatus in se. It should never be self-referential or kind of collapse on yourself, because then you're just spinning your wheels. You're just talking to yourself.
Exactly.
Right? You're wrestling with yourself. Right? You're rationalizing whatever you're doing. There's so many things going on there. It could be a turn inward inviting God, but often that turn inward is most successfully done with a friend.
Yes.
And with someone who you open your heart to, right? With your soul's brother. Right?
I love it. I hope, God, I have so many hopes. I have all sorts of hopes. I hope this podcast becomes a place of deepening friendship for us.
Yeah.
I hope it becomes a place of deepening friendship for our viewers, where they get a little bit of deeper insight into us. But I hope it inspires our viewers. I would love it if this inspired our viewers to want to connect more deeply with people in their lives.
Right.
To take risks, to be vulnerable, to find friends, to find your soul's brother.
Yeah.
I think we so need it. We pay such lip service to it in Catholic circles. We say things like, well, we're made in the image and likeness of a God who is in his very nature a communion of persons. Yeah, we're made for relationship. But really, I take that seriously now. In therapy, actually, I take that so seriously that I actually think it's fair to say that you can think about things like parents leaving or divorcing or friends bullying you, or you can think about them as traumatic, because I think we're so in need of communion with one another, very seriously. And we find ways to sort of paper it over when those things get hurt or wounded or we don't have those needs met. And we can paper it over in really attractive ways, but I think really we're made for it and we need it. And I hope we talk about it enough and we unfold it enough, we crack it open enough in our lives and other people's lives, that our viewers, our listeners, try to find those friendships.
And maybe they can start the conversations, right? Maybe this is like share the link.
Send this
Send this to your group text. No, but I mean, right? Because I mean, in certain ways, right? Is once just like we were talking about literature becoming that place where because it's external from you. If it's a little vulnerable to just come up to your friend and be like, "I need a soul's brother. Can you be my soul's brother?" It's like, "Hey, you want to watch this interesting podcast with me that will
beautiful." Okay, we'll keep rolling with it because there is a line from a poem. Let me think. Speaking of, it's called like September 19th, 1938. It's by who's it by? Let's see. He's sitting in a bar. World War II is about to break out. Let me see if Google will pop up for me.
Google can do it.
Oh, W.H. Auden. That's who it's by. W.H. Auden. And I want to read a line to you. W.H. Auden. September, what's it called? Thanks for being patient with me, viewers. September 1st, 1939 by W.H. Auden. He has this great line in here where he says, let's see, bear with me. Okay, it's long. Let's get to the good
most
part.
modern poems are.
It is. Oh, here he says, all I have is a voice to undo the folded lie, the romantic lie in the brain of the sensual man in the street and the lie of the authority whose buildings grope the sky. There is no such thing as the state and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. This is the line. He says, we must love one another or die.
Wow.
And I just think like, man, that is...
there's like a spiritual truth there, but there's also like just a human...
Deep human was... we wither. We like, how do we...
I mean, it's like the studies the Soviet Union did where they had those babies and they wouldn't hold them. Like they would feed them and they would take care of them, but they literally died because they wouldn't have human contact.
And when you look at, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there were all these orphanages that were like tucked back in sort of wooded areas. And when they were liberated, these kids had been basically raised in cages. And they couldn't speak. They had incredibly low IQs, huge behavior. I mean, it is so like love and touch and human interaction, like deep quality human interaction and engagement is crucial to our flourishing. So I love that. I'd love for this podcast to help everyone take each other more seriously. I was reading C.S. Lewis's The Weight of Glory yesterday, and he says like, look, there's no ordinary people. You've never met a mere mortal. Everyone you meet is destined for either heaven or hell. And if you could see them in their future glory, you'd be tempted to worship them.
Right.
And if you could see them in the hideousness of hell, you would almost die of fright. But you've never met like an ordinary person. And so to take one another seriously, to love one another or die, to let poetry and beauty and love permeate our stories and our... I hope that's what this is. I hope that's what this podcast is.
Amen.
So,
I love it. That's good. Well,
stay with us.
Yes. Subscribe.
Subscribe.
Join us. Keep watching. We welcome you. You're in my prayers.
Same.